Hello, everyone. Let's wait for a minute or two, and then we'll get started. Okay, hello, everyone. I am Stephen Acabado, Associate Professor of Anthropology at UCLA and the co-convener of this webinar series. I would like to welcome everyone to panel two, Wisdom of the Landscape, the first of two panels that will talk about environmental justice issues. This is the second of 10 panels of the webinar series, Indigenous Peoples, Heritage, and Landscape in the Asia Pacific, Knowledge, Co-Production, Policy Change, and Empowerment. Before we start, we would like to acknowledge that the Department of Anthropology, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, the Kotsen Institute of Archaeology, and the Asia Pacific Center at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrieleno Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hunuk Vitam ancestors, Ahihirum elders, and Iyohin Kim, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. We are grateful for the support of the Wenner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research through the webinars on the future of anthropology grant, the Henry Luce Foundation, the New England University First Peoples' Rights Center, the National Chenji University Center for Taiwan, Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies, or CITIPILS, the UCLA Kotsen the UCLA Kotsen Institute of Archaeology, and the UCLA Asia Pacific Center. Um, the UCLA Department of Anthropology, UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies, University of Hawaii at Manoa Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Ifugao State University, the Partido State University, and the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement are co-hosts of this webinar series. Panel two, this panel discusses how communities are solving ecological problems using local knowledge systems and at the same time claiming the rights over their lands. This is the first of two panels that will look at how engagement and empowerment result in a more sustainable and equitable ecological conservation. Ecological degradation from resource extraction has the strongest impact on indigenous communities and others who live right alongside the resources, and thus um, the extraction. Even when communities are not fully displaced from the land, they can still lose access through restrictive enclosures and also from the physical removal of forests and the destruction of waterways. This panel will discuss community-led initiatives and collaborative research projects that attempt to foreground the ideas and concerns of indigenous groups living within and around project areas with respect for their knowledge of the landscape, the situation, as well as possible solutions. Drawing examples from Cambodia, Indonesia, and Guam, panelists focus on both policy implications of their work and the impacts of their activities on local communities. We have a dedicated Q&A portion at the end of our discussion. Attendees can submit questions at any time during the discussion. Zoom attendees can use the Q&A feature, whereas YouTube and Facebook attendees can submit questions via the comment section. Professor Dawe Kwan, Associate Professor at the Department of Ethnology and at the National Chenji University and the co-convener of this webinar series, will introduce our panelist and moderator.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. It's my honor to introduce you, our panelist and moderator today. Our first panelist is Cronin Work. Cronin Work is Associate Professor in the Department of Ethnology at National Chenji University in Taiwan. Doing active research in Cambodia since 2005, Cronin's research incorporates elements from the anthropology of religion, development, and the environment. Also, the history of Southeast Asia political formations and contemporary political economy and climate change. Her new book, titled Empire, Religions, Development, and Environment in Cambodia, explores Cambodia's development frontier through the lens of migrant families, land spirit, loggers, and soldiers, all creating a new village out of the forest. Our second panelist is Micah Fisher. Micah Fisher is a faculty member at University of Hawaii at Manoa in the Matsunaga Institute for Conflict Resolution and the Program for Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance. He also holds a joint position in the Forestry Department at Hasanuddin University in Indonesia. His research interests center on sustainability dimension of landscape and watershed, and more specifically revolve around rural smallholder dilemmas and policy to empower land right and livelihood. Micah has long-term partnership with the indigenous community of Sulawesi to help secure formal state recognition of indigenous land. Our third panelist, Elsa Dumoulinier, is the Associate Director for Natural Resources at the University of Guam's Center for Island Sustainability, where she leads a team of biologists to conduct research on forest and watershed restoration, endangered species protection and recovery, and green roof. Elsa is an avid advocate for sustainable living and the protection of Guam's biocultural diversity. Her research focuses on conservation genetic in Micronesia, traditional ecological knowledge of endemic plant species, social activism, and aim to find policy benefiting the protection of Guam's ecosystem and its people. Our moderator today is Guy Charlton. Guy has a broad range of legal experience, and he is currently an associate professor in law at the University of New England in Australia, where he assisted in the establishment of UNE First People's Rights and Law Center. He has lectured law in New Zealand, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and published law articles in 5 different jurisdictions. His research interests include constitutional conflicts and indigenous rights, and the study of indigenous people's hunting, fishing, gathering rights in different countries. He also looked into historical and contemporary disputes concerning the nature and understanding of sovereignty that affect the legal construction of indigenous rights nowadays. So we have very outstanding panelists and moderator today. I would like to once again welcome all our participants and have Guy take over from here. Guy.
Thank you very much, Daya and Steve, for that very kind introduction. What we are going to speak about today in terms of, I want to frame the discussion. We want to frame the discussion on what landscapes are and how the communities and our panelists understand and define these landscapes. So I thought what we could do is go through each of our panelists and ask them to speak on that issue and discuss the ecological issues that are confronting this landscape. And I'll ask Courtney to go first on this. You're muted, Courtney.
Good. Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you, Guy. Sorry about that. I'm going to share a screen with you. Is that coming up for everyone? There. How's that? Can you guys see my shared screen? All right. So thank you very much, everyone. I just want to give you a quick introduction to the landscapes that we're going to be talking about. My work here is in Cambodia and here in Southeast Asia. Within Cambodia, the landscape we're looking at is the Prelong Forest, which is here in between the Mekong River and the Tonle Sap River. The Prelong Forest is the largest lowland evergreen forest in Indochina. And you can see here, starting from 1989, the dramatic changes that we're seeing in forest cover. This last slide is from 2014. I have some more recent ones that I'll show you in a little bit. But this gives you an idea of the extent of the forest landscape. As far as the way local people view this landscape, this is a place to get resources. This is where we get everything that we need. This is rattan. We are fishing. This is resin to make the boats and the baskets waterproof and also to sell. This particular landscape is a favorite elephant habitat. This is a natural grass field forest. This is where you find the big game. You don't find big game deep in the forest. You find it here in these grassy areas. This is another view of the forest that has come to people recently since we've been collaborating. This is the view from the drone, far and wide or rich, deep canopy. People love these shots. And these areas here along the riverbank and these little islands and little clumps, this is where you find the fish. This is where all the best fish are. But now people don't understand themselves to be the owners of these resources. The people understand themselves to be a part of a larger community. And the owner of the resources is quite literally Majatak Majatday, the owner of the water and the land. And this is a deep and long relationship. And people understand themselves to be the children and the grandchildren of this honored ancestor. The ancestor owns the resources, and the children and grandchildren live and thrive in this environment at the pleasure of the ancestor, and not the other way around. So one of the most striking things about this landscape is the dramatic transformations that have been going on since development arrived in earnest in the late 90s, early 2000s. So this is the landscape people are living in. Here's the community of the Prelong Community Network that we're working with. In addition to illegal logging, single cut logging in the forest, we have plantations moving in all around the perimeter of the forest. Here's a sawmill in Croce. This is a transformation into pulp tree plantation. In 2016, the Prelong Forest was awarded a sanctuary, a Prelong Wildlife Sanctuary, protected area. And you can see the forest here in 2016. These are slides. This is forest data, forest cover data from the University of Maryland, adapted by the NGO Licado in Cambodia. And you can see how difficult this is. Here's the same forest area in 2020. And this area here in 2016 that you see outside of the protected area was a Red Plus project. And you can see this is almost all gone. There's encroachment all down in the bottom areas and up in the top areas. So you can see the difficulties in protecting this forest area. What we've done in 2014, two university projects came into this area independently of each other, one from the University of Copenhagen and one from the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, which is where I was located, and collaborating with Chiang Mai University. And the Prelong Community Network had been active in forest patrol and actively trying to stem the tide of illegal logging in their area. And what we did in collaboration with them is to add some resources and add some tools. We added smartphones that they use to gather data, to collect illegal logging information, to collect tree stumps, as well as general forest product information. We added interview techniques and how to record what you're doing so that it becomes data. We added GPS technologies to map areas and drone technologies to monitor deforestation areas. And in collaboration with the University of Copenhagen, since 2015, the Prelong Community Network has published forest monitoring reports with really hard-hitting data about what exactly is going on and the extent of the forest damage. But you can see that these issues completely disrupt people's traditional relationships with the land, with the resources, and with their economies. So I'll close it here. We'll talk more later. I'll give it to others. Thank you.
Micah, do you want to speak next?
Sure, I'm going to share my screen. And again, thanks everybody. While I'm setting this up, I really enjoyed last week's panel. I think lots of great issues were raised, and I think this is a really great initiative. So I'm just going to very quickly. We kind of agreed to share a couple minutes about our sites to prompt the overall conversation. My research took place in Sulawesi, here at the top in the middle of Indonesia, right at kind of the center, in a province called South Sulawesi. And at the southeast toe here, you can see an area about 22,000 hectares. And this is a place that came to be very widely known in the last 5 years as the Kajang Indigenous region. And the reason that it gained so much attention was because it was among the first to get formal title, land returned back to an indigenous community in Indonesia. So lots of institutional reforms about the possibility to reclaim state land. And this was among the first initiatives that succeeded and became a precedent-setting site. So that's the overall narrative that we know about the Kajang in terms of gaining recognition, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to really show what this area, this 22,000 hectares that I showed earlier, looks like. So the western part of it here, the areas in blue, looks like this upper left image. So what you think of, this is rubber plantations, and about a quarter of this landscape is controlled by a rubber plantation, industrial scale operations. And now in the middle of the image here is the sacred forest of the Kajang, right? So this is the center of their cosmology. This is the area that was on paper, it was state forests. But it's still day to day very much controlled by local indigenous practices. And this was the land that was formally given title back to the indigenous community. So depending on how much you know about the constitutional court developments in Indonesia, this was a precedent-setting case. So around the state, this forest, this sacred forest, you can see here images on the bottom right. There's these traditional areas that the Pasangri Kajang, which is the local moral code and belief systems, is very much closely adhered to. And this is how these locations look in and around the forest. On the bottom left is kind of a more a common landscape that you would see. There's roads where houses are built along the way. And then there's all these areas in between, which is really going to be the focus of what I consider the issues of the landscape to be. So I was fortunate in 2014 to be part of this task force, right? I was an independent researcher. I wanted to study participatory action research. I wanted to study, this was unique because local government and NGOs, activists that in the past had been very much at odds with each other, and conflict had happened. There was, you know, deaths that happened with conflicts between the rubber plantation and the indigenous community here. But because of the regulatory developments that happened, here we have pictures of really a participatory approach. So local traditional leaders were involved, the local government, central government, NGOs got together to draft a policy on how to return land back to local ownership. And on the right here, this is President Joko Widodo, still the current president, in a ceremony providing land back to the leadership, the Kajang leadership. But as I was participating in all these public consultations with the communities, what I really reflect on a moment that I kind of strayed away. I was sitting at a coffee shop, talking to local disaffected youth, and I was really struck by the cynicism about this process, right? So I was very hopeful about, you know, this process as a process of environmental justice, of returning land rights to local communities. And when I talked to people day to day, there was a variety of different perspectives about these issues. And what I began to do was I really wanted to shift the research approach to reflect that. And so there's two ways that I wanted to do that. The first is, you know, what is the basic thing that people do on a day-to-day basis? And most people are involved in some form of farming. So what I started to do was just participate. I started working with families and joining them in planting corn, in planting rice, and following every step of the way. Where do they get their seeds? Where do they plant it? How do they maintain it? How do they harvest it? How does it go to market? And how do these relationships produce and reproduce the landscape? And so corn and rice are the seasonal kind of crops. And then I learned how to tap rubber and to work on black pepper to really get a sense of what are the local concerns related to these institutional, these formal ways of getting recognition of land that were that were gaining so much attention in Indonesia at that time. The second way that I engaged and wanted to work and partner with local perspectives was on the village planning processes. So on the one hand, I would go farming every day. On the other hand, I would show up to how local development decisions were made. So how gaining recognition was then translated into the processes of coming up with village plans. So I was observing how village elections happen. I was going around with local village administrators. They had new requirements of doing village boundaries, so we helped them do village boundaries. We would walk these boundaries and have these incredible conversations about what is happening, how the landscape is changing. So I'm just going to stop it there. I promise to keep it very short, but the overall kind of approach was that thinking about how formal recognition translates into the day-to-day processes that affect people's lives in terms of how the landscape then recreates itself, as well as how new policies and how local leadership translates those decisions into how development or how things go going forward.
Thanks, Mika. Elsa?
Yes, thank you. I'll share my screen. You can see it? Okay. Have a day, everybody. I want to show a few introductory slides about the social movement to protect the landscapes of Letetzen and how this social movement advocates for biocultural protection and the restoration of indigenous land sovereignty in Guam or Guam. The landscape of Letetzen and Tailalo is really important to this story. And if you look here at this left picture on the top of the cliffs there, that is where Tailalo is and currently under jurisdiction of the Department of Defense. Letetzen lays below there, below the cliff and along the ocean, and is currently a wildlife refuge. I will speak more about the history of these lands as we go into the discussion later, and how the original landowners are still fighting for the return of their homelands. For the Chamorro people, a living landscape embodies the close relationship between the people and their environment and is really interwoven with culture and spirituality. Letetzen is one of those places. It's actually a place where you can see, the only place on Guam actually where you can see evidence of every period of human life on the island. And here you see a picture in the middle of a latte house on capped stone pillars dating from the latte period. And if you see here on the right hand side, you can see a picture of the current view of these latte villages. And this is a place that the Chamorro people will still try to connect with as part of their history. And it's also a way to learn more about how their ancestors lived. And although schools now, they offer Chamorro language and cultural instruction, the landscape of Letetzen offers like a really place-based, more learning experience compared to the classroom experience. And it's really important that students and people can still connect with that extraordinary knowledge and wisdom there that is visible in the landscape. And when I was talking to for my research to younger people, they told me that the landscape of Letetzen, for instance, seeing handprints in the caves really connected them with their ancestors, and it helped them, the abundance of the cultural presence there and the spirituality with their ancestors really helped them finding their own cultural identity. And I thought that was really very powerful. And there's many stories that were shared. It's also a place where Chamorro people connect spiritually with their ancestors, as that is really key to their animistic worldview. Besides, of showing evidence, there's actually evidence of healing practices visible in the landscape today. For instance, in the limestone, you can still see lumok, which are the pestle, and mortar, the mortar and pestle still in place, engraved in the landscape. But today, the zoamte, which are traditional healers, still go to Letetzen to collect amot or medicine, and they also bring their apprentices to learn about medicinal practices. And here I want to show some pictures. Here on the left hand side, you see Jessica. She's looking at Kakmantazi or Triumpheta umbens, and this is a plant that is not so commonly found anymore on Guam, and healers really go to Letetzen to collect these plants. And there's one healer that uses it for baby's medicine, and when she needs to prepare that medicine, she'll always go to Letetzen. And it's a lot of the medicine and are combination medicine, so they usually need a lot of ingredients, but this is one that is really wanted. And then on the right-hand side, you can see Zoamte Susan. She's collecting the fruits of nanaso or Scaevola tacata, and that is used for eye ailments. It's actually pretty common, this plant still on the island, but they feel, the healers feel that the plants are more potent there at Letetzen and the fruits are bigger. And you can see she's squeezing some of the juice of the fruits in her eye. So it's actually used against pink eye, but also for just a kind of regular Visine to relieve dry eyes. So, and my research, besides of policy research, I looked into the ethnobotany of Letetzen. If anybody has any questions about that during the presentation, I'm more than welcome to answer those. But for this book here, I'm more looking into the regulations, the policies relating to fighting to keep access to these places. This is, oh, sorry. This is a view to the beach side, and the waters are also used for fishing. And before this was a wildlife refuge, it was also used. The wood would also be used for building huts for fishing. My research mostly focused on botany because I'm kind of also an botanist. So, but I just want to highlight that this area is also very important traditionally for fishing. Then the people and cultural groups gather at Letetzen for ceremony. And Leonard Iriarte, who is a master of Chamorro chant, told me that they typically do ceremonies at spiritually charged places in Letetzen, which are, for instance, the shoreline or cave areas and latte villages. So it's really important to note that this landscape is used for spiritual practices. So the current social movement to protect Letetzen results actually from ongoing historical injustices that still shape the nature of the island's governance. And I can go more into detail later, maybe to talk about how the political status is right now with the Guahan. But for now, for the introduction, I'll keep it a little more brief and say that the United States Department of Defense plans to for the relocation of the US Marine Corps personnel from Okinawa to Guahan included the construction of a live fire training range complex. And here you can see on the map, so the blue is Letetzen, which I showed pictures of along the beach. And then up on the ridge is the other part, which is called Tailalo in the native language and is renamed by the Department of Defense as Northwest Field. And so I didn't show any pictures of Tailalo because that is inaccessible for people to go there. But I want to highlight that Tailalo, so in Tailalo, there will be 156 acres of limestone forest that will be bulldozed to build a firing range. And that landscape is also very important to the Chamorro people. It not only is a very pristine forest with endangered species, it also has a lot of cultural artifacts that haven't been explored yet and are very special to the Chamorro people. For my research, I'm also focusing on the last, the fight for the last Hudson Lagoon tree, or Cerianthus nelsoni, which is located in the footprint, next to the footprint of the firing range. You can see the green triangle there. And although this is a critical endangered species and there is only one adult seed-producing tree left on Guahan, that this tree won't be cut down because of the firing range, but there will be only 100 feet buffer around the tree left, which is not enough to sustain a healthy population and will also jeopardize the tree during storms. So this tree actually became kind of a symbol for resistance for the movement that resulted from this. So this is important to note, but it's also important to say that people cannot connect with this tree, unfortunately, because it's a restricted place. And then you can see Letetzen there. So on in the blue, and the surface danger zone of this firing range will actually prevent access to Letetzen for traditional healers. So not completely, 68% of the lands will not be accessible during the use of the firing range. And then
Thanks for-
last, yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. I thought
I
you
have
were
one more
finished.
slide.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Okay, a direct action group, Protege Tedzen, started to, to protect the natural resources and the cultural resources at Tailalo and Letedzen, and brings together like cultural activists, environmentalists, scientists, original landowners, healers, all kinds of people, and they were advocating with the policymakers. But I'll go more into their actions later as we go through the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry about that, Elsa. You know, one of the things that interests me about these topics in this diverse range of the world where you guys are talking about is that the similarities as well as the uniqueness in the work and the challenges facing the communities. The way clearly all these communities have issues with land recognition and the use of their customary rules and environmental degradation, it sounds like. And so I guess I want to ask you guys, what is the extent of the customary rules that are used? Elsa, you showed a few pictures of people, and Courtney did also. What is the extent that the customary rules are being used in these areas, and how are they responding to these issues of ecological challenge, degradation, or recognition for that matter? I defer to whoever wants to speak to that question, answer that question initially.
Well, I can go ahead and start. Thanks for that good question. It's actually, it's really fraught, of course, because almost all of the state policies currently hamper local solutions to ecological problems and disrupt the cosmological relationships and the whole logic of the system of cosmology that people have used for generations to maintain their livelihoods in these landscapes. Extractive economics simply breaks all the rules. And so these initiatives come in and they do dramatically change local landscapes and local understandings of how to work with the land and how to work also with the authorities and with the government, which is a very real threat and a real need. In my own situation, there's in the field site that I'm working in Prelong, there's a couple of things that happen. Local people, one, we see that when we tell authorities that what we're looking at, what we're researching, what we're concerned about are local practices and traditional beliefs, they tend to back away and they don't get in the way of what people are trying to do. As soon as it becomes apparent that those investigations push up against economic activities, then we often run into a little bit of resistance and a little bit of trouble in executing the projects that we're trying to do, especially in mapping particular areas. Communities have tried to grab certain areas that are powerful, that have local significance and are known to be agentive places where the medicine is stronger, places where you might go to have a healing ceremony. And that has been mildly effective when they can work inside of state policies to suggest a community forest, for example, around this one small mountain that has a powerful site at the top of it. And so it's a push me pull you, and you can make inroads a little bit and then you get pushback, and it's a very constrained environment where people are trying to do this work. And in terms of finding community, finding solutions to community problems, the real difficulty that we have and that we're seeing really starkly in Prelong is that the community is not homogenous. I mean, you can't say that the Kui community in Prelong all has the same ideas about what it means to live in the land and what it means to be successful and what it means to be a member of the community. So that's one of the things that gets most difficult. And when we talk about communities, we kind of pretend that they might be, the same, they might be homogenous actors. But they're really not. And so I'll look very much forward to the comments of the other panelists about that particular issue. But that's what we're seeing in Prelong. So I can cut off with that.
So could I just add to that then for you guys, is the concept of landscape itself then contested, are you saying in as well? What is that landscape?
Oh, yes, certainly. Well, the map that I showed you of the protected area, the Prelong Forest, as far as communities are concerned, the first map that I showed you, I wonder if I can share a screen quick. The first map that I showed you was that's the forest. Let's see, can you see that screen? So let's see if I can go back to this. Okay, so this here, 1989, that's the forest that people understand. And so then we go here to 2016 when they made it a protected area, and that's just a trunk, right? Can you see my pointer when I do this?
Yes.
So all this area and all this area, even across the river, these were all considered the landscape that people lived and worked in. And it's just a completely different animal now. Thanks, that's a good question.
Thanks. Does any of the other panelists want to speak to that?
So I'll jump in very quickly in terms of, yeah, without going back to the map, I think livelihoods have a really, have a central role here. And the landscape is divided between a 100-year-long existence of a rubber plantation that really began to expand a lot in the 70s and 80s, and that's where the resistance movements began to push back against these enclosures that were happening through, security forces. I see the questions about, how the arrival of security forces and things like that. And casualties did happen, right? 3 people died in these clashes in 2003. And that's where indigeneity and the movements for Indonesian adat really became the resistance. These used to be farmers resisting against the plantation, but now they were talking about these issues in terms of indigeneity, and that gave them additional opportunities to be able to contest these landscapes. But last week's panelist themes and what Courtney was just talking about in terms of the differences between the communities, there's clearly a difference. And I think what was so interesting in my research was how the agriculture, the things that people planted really connected with their values about what things should be, right? So the people who are rice farmers who depend on this rotational system of changing over ownership, there's some clear pressures that are happening specific to rice and just the role of rice in traditional cultural practices in terms of how much rice you need to give to certain family members during a wedding really puts pressures on the landscape in terms of what your responsibility in the community is. But for other people who are really, very dependent on smallholder rubber, for example. So there's a plantation, and one of the really interesting contestations that come out of when you see the landscape is that local people started innovating and developing their own smallholder rubber and finding their own markets to sell to. And then other tree crops started to come in, and then you had these shifts, what these crop booms that I like to think of them. They're these waves that ripple across the landscape. When one price comes up, new tree crops start to repopulate the landscape. When I was there in 2016, everybody was kind of trying to get rid of the rubber they had because the prices were so low in order to plant black pepper, which had become this boom price. But if you go there now, people who are dependent on cloves, they can't sell their cloves because it doesn't have any price literally whatsoever right now. So these critical decisions on the household level are really fundamental for understanding the legal aspects that I went in so interested in, right? It's like, how do we make sure that we help communities to secure their land? And then when you talk to communities, it's much more about what's the price of rubber versus pepper right now? When can I get my rotation of planting rice on the landscape? So I think for anybody doing this kind of research, having those contextual factors of how people create and recreate the landscape are really fundamental for understanding what's going on.
And that creation isn't static, you're saying. It's ongoing. It's an ongoing recreation, if I'm understanding that right.
Yeah, and not only is it ongoing, it also relates to local authority, right? And that's a really critical part, because we think that getting this piece of paper of land title is an endpoint, and we have the later session today is about activism, right? And my experience, especially like moving out of this community and seeing how activism works in terms of pushing on the legal and regulatory side of things. It's like, get that piece of paper title, and then let's go find the next fight to work on, without fully appreciating what the implications and how the authority shifts and these dynamics recreate new systems of authority and contestations locally. So I think there's something to be said about continuing after the recognition, or after gaining the title, or after the legal victories, because that's where people reconstitute the local authority and decision-making processes.
Elsa, do you want to?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So first I wanted to say, like, for instance, the landscape of Letetzen being a sacred place, that is important to say that if you cut off access for Indigenous people, that is the same as land taking. And that's a really important point to say, and especially, so for the military buildup, when you do the NEPA processes, that was not considered as land taking, the preventing the access to Letetzen, which is actually problematic, because that is not the case for Indigenous people. In their worldview, that is the same as land taking, because they cannot continue their practices of healing. They cannot they cannot go and connect with the landscape and spiritually. So that's a problem. But for the customary practices that your question, like responding to ecological challenges. So the sacred connection to the land, and instill the respect that is instilled to the resources is very much still alive here with the Chamorro people. As they, for instance, enter the forest, they'll ask permission, to their ancestors, and it's really that kind of practices that is, despite the long history of colonization, it's still very much alive. And I think grounded in this spirituality, I think customary practices are really important. And we can also see that with the healers when they enter the forest. There's this really respect towards the resources, and they will only take what they need and leave on a part of the plant to regrow. But let's say they need roots or maybe a whole tree, then you would make sure there's seedlings or already adult trees there to take their place, right? So, and traditionally, of course, there would be permission asked to the chief, because they would be, regulating marine and tenure systems. But this is not in place anymore due to colonization, and we have other kinds of rules and regulations. And I don't know if people are familiar with the NEPA process, but with the NEPA process, so when there's significant effects due to an action, in this case for the live fire training range, they have to come up with different alternatives in that process and abide by environmental laws, but also ask people for input, right? And the input of the people was really like, we need to protect these sacred spaces. And that was unfortunately not taken into account, the spirituality and these practices that are customary practices. And that's really important to note, and maybe we'll go further into that discussion later with the activism, but I think it's a good time to say it because it relates to the customary practices. And in Guanghan, there is a lot, 1/3 of the island is military property, so it's not the only sacred place that is not accessible anymore for the people. And this particular place, the Tazan, is very, it's very sacred to the Chamorro people. And yeah, but we can get more into details later about the rules and regulations.
So I guess I would like to just follow up with everyone and before we talk about some of the activism issues. And I guess the issue that comes out of the discussion is, to what extent do governments take, or planning agencies or state institutions take into consideration, in your experiences and the experiences of the communities you've been working with, of those customary practices? I mean, Mika, you mentioned the discussion at the local level. Are state authorities taking this material, this understanding, this cosmology on board, or are they basically, as Elsa, you suggested, I've worked in the NEPA process myself, is they check a box and they move on. I guess, what's your experience? What is people's experience as to that aspect of working with land rights and landscapes? I'm sorry.
So I'll just jump in very quickly first, since you mentioned my name. The idea of government is really interesting from the local perspective, right? A lot of the engagement that I had with government before going to do research was, very much in terms of the activism and making sure that, 2/3 of Indonesia is state forest, right? How do you get opportunities for local communities to reclaim that land? When you think about it in these terms, the scale of historical dispossession that might represent is really profound, right? We're talking about area the size of Japan that, maybe there are local customary systems that may have been in place, but have been kind of drawn under state boundaries. So that's the way that I was thinking about it. But when you scale down into the local communities, it's not that there's outside people in the process and there's local people who are outside of the process. There's local representation that serve as the village heads, right? That are the intermediaries of these processes. And I spent about a year just following the politics of a local village election, right? So basically 4 different families who are the landed elite kind of going at each other saying, no, I want to be the one that makes the decision. So in that context of participating in a policy-making task force, which was, conceptually perfect, right? It was participatory action research. Drafting the legal regulation to get land rights was done with representation of the local traditional elders, with the local government agencies, with activists who wouldn't sit in the same room as government at one point, right? So having these people at the table coming up with a policy, it was like, this is an ideal scenario. But then you turn that into, how does that change the local governance practices among the local community? It's still local families of landed elite trying to expand their own areas that they control their own smallholder rubber and the alliances between themselves, depending on how they want to reproduce the landscape. So what's really critical about thinking about the government in this way is that the local village heads, if you win a village election, you also get customary leadership status, right? So the state and the local customary institutions, there's not a fine line between them, right? They are constantly working with one another. And obviously, if the option is big plantation wipes out the whole history of a place versus only the local community controlling, those are extremes, and those obviously exist. But there's so much happening in the middle, in between those extremes, that then are the ones who end up being able to make the decisions about what happens next. And they're the ones that start interpreting things like legal land title and recognition of indigenous rights, and they shift hats very quickly. I'm the village head one day to go get resources from the state, and I'm the gala whatever who is representative of these kind of cultural decision-making practices.
Does anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would like to. So first of all, I wanted to mention that Guahan is actually an unincorporated territory of the United States, and still is one of the 17 non-self-governing territories that is listed with the United Nations. And they really have the right to their natural resources and should be able to give consent. And this is not what's been happening during the NEPA process. I also wanted to delve a little bit more into the NEPA process, because your question was really about how state policies hamper local solutions to ecological problems. So the NEPA process has actually an environmental justice portion that is really meant to include indigenous people and their vision. And that hasn't been used, I think, not on Guam, but also elsewhere. I have read that that portion of NEPA is not really used. And then there's also a few problems met with that law specifically to island communities too, is that first of all, when you have all these alternatives that are being proposed, NEPA doesn't say that you have to take the least effect, the alternative with the least effects. You can actually choose they can actually choose whatever alternative they want. Secondly, public input only needs to be considered. So they can take the public input and give comments back, but it doesn't need to be taken into account really. So, and that's actually a little bit what happened on Guahan. And there's two phases of public input. There is one when the environmental impact statement starts. Before that, there is like the public scoping, but unfortunately, there was not much transparency. And there's also, people's input wasn't taken into account. And once the environmental impact statement draft was there was a lot of public comments that were about spirituality and also about indigenous practices. And these kinds of not real data, according to, like more US law, wasn't taken into account. And that's very unfortunate. I really think that's lacking in NEPA, that spirituality and practices is not being taken into consideration when you do an evaluation for NEPA. And then secondly, there's also a few other laws that go along with NEPA process, and that's the Endangered Species Act. And I talked about the Hudson Lago tree, the last tree there. There is actually no input that is necessary from the public with US law, which is very unfortunate, because endangered species, it's not just scientists that know things about it or feel things about it. I really think that the people of Guahan really wanted to protect that tree. It's actually the largest tree in the Marianas, and it also occurs on Rhoda, and it's also they only have 35 trees, and it kind of also has this relationship with the islands within the archipelago. And the Pretehiletazin actually submitted documents to really advocate not to build a firing range so close to the tree, but that was not taken into account because there is legally no public input allowed. And there already the conversation stopped for the Endangered Species Act. And then with the National Historic Preservation Act, the problem with Tailalo, which is the area that is not accessible for people, people don't know what cultural artifacts are there because they can't go there. That's already a problem. And then once there were more artifacts found, it was hard to go back and reevaluate. And then mitigation also is something that is in Indigenous perspective not really possible because they really want to keep those artifacts in place, right? Compared to like having them stored in a museum. But of course, the Letetzen access, again, that's a very important point why NEPA was really, where NEPA really was failing and not taking that into consideration, how people related to the landscape really there. I think that's a major, you know, that's the answer on the politics.
I've got to unmute myself here. Courtney, do you want to add to that or at all? Or yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I can add to that. It's actually the situation in Cambodia is a little bit interesting because in some ways the cosmological understandings of the world are between the local indigenous communities that have been living in the forests and the Khmer authorities are not completely different. There's a lot of overlap in the cosmological understandings, and the Cambodian authorities are pretty aware of Majatuk Majatde, and Lokta is an element in most of their lives. So, so it's really interesting to watch this interplay between them. And Micah made such a really good observation that earlier about the way that people are thinking about land. It isn't so much about having land, it's really about using land. And that ties directly into the whole deep history of traditional relationships with the land. You know, we don't own it, but we definitely need to use it. And this is how we get our livelihoods. And so what we're seeing, what I'm seeing is people shifting their understanding about where the power is coming from. And I've even heard local authorities say, yeah, that might be Lokta's forest, but the government owns it. And so everyone's aware of this system, but they're also aware of the changes in the system. And and Cambodia is such an interesting place. The international community, it's been one of the last kind of frontiers of available land to develop industrially. So there's been a huge land rush in Cambodia from external actors that's been promoted by the Cambodian government because of course it makes them look good, right? They're a shining Asian star and their GDP is rising and they're, you know, coming into this global economy. And everybody has plans for Cambodia. And in fact, if you look at the ADBs, the Asian Development Bank's economic corridors, this southern one in Cambodia, they just runs right across Prelong. And you can see how people are being pulled into this. So the local authorities will come in and they'll be like, oh, no, Sweden is the way of the past. You can't do your shifting agriculture because it doesn't fit with conservation, because it takes too much forest. And really, you can make a lot of money on those cashews, you know, and you can plant the cashews right in your Sweden forests. And then you don't take up so much forest and you don't need new land. And so there's a real kind of this soft pulling of people into the larger global economic system that is not only hard for people to resist, but there's also, even in the logic of traditional cosmologies, there's a certain logic to it that this is a subsistence strategy, right? So it is really fascinating to watch the way that these relationships evolve. And then in Cambodia, I don't know about your other sites, especially Indonesia, but wow, then people get in debt. So once you have cashews on your Swidden fields, then you can get a little piece of paper. It's not really a land title, but it's a piece of paper. And then you can borrow money from the microfinance organizations. And then people get locked in. So it's an ongoing evolution. People are both, there's a number of people that are trying to protect things as they've been and trying to maintain the old relationships, and they're definitely still there. As Elsa says, they're still there. You don't walk into the deep forest without some acknowledgement of the fact that it's not your forest and you're visiting, and you say, hey. And people do. They're like, oh, Tom, right? Your children and your grandchildren are here, and we're just coming in, and we're gonna get some of this and some of that. But at the same, and then there's a lot of people that are just going in. They're like, this is money. This is good. This is the way of the future. I don't know if this road is good or bad, but I like it, right? We're in. And then there's people on the other end, and we're seeing this all over. We're seeing it in Guam for sure. We're seeing it in Taiwan for sure, that are saying, whoa, 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 I was in. And now I think I want to be out. This is not working out so well. I don't know about this. So the situation in Cambodia is quite dynamic, but we're seeing all ends of this spectrum.
Can I add a few things to this?
Yes.
So yeah. So first of all, I just want to say that, like, for instance, Guam is, it's a lot of different cultures here, right? But I think, the customary practice of asking permission, for instance, to the forest is something that I see here with my neighbors everywhere you go. It's still very embedded in practices, and despite colonization and even religious aspects, even with the Catholic Church, there's practices that are, traditional practices that are still alive here in Guam. And so it's important to recognize that spirituality is really recognized by the whole community. We have also sacred trees, which is also a way of protecting, resources. We have the Nunu tree here in Guam, and we have a tree in our little street here, and when it's overhanging too much, nobody wants to cut it, like, it's so sacred, right? So I think it's important to highlight that. But the other aspect I wanted to say is that, the fight kind of for Litetzen, right, or trying to preserve that for the people is really not just, the cultural practitioners. There's also scientists that really were trying to advocate to protect the forest at Talalo and the plate and Litetzen, because of ecological reasons too, and because the landscape itself, for instance, at Talalo has very deep karst, like limestone karst, and once that would be removed, it's gone forever. You can never restore that landscape. And mitigation that is proposed is really, it's like a forest enhancement site, and it's degraded forest that they're going to try to, come back to a more natural forest, but that will never be replaced. So it was like a co-production of knowledge of people, scientists, and then indigenous people, but everything was grounded in indigenous spirituality, I have to say, and practices, because so Amte and their healing practices was for sure one of the most important aspects. And of course also the return of the lands, because in 1957, Litetzen, until then, Litetzen was owned by Chamorro people, and it was condemned by the Department of Defense for their use. And later, when they didn't need it anymore, instead of returning it to the original landowners, it actually went to US Fish and Wildlife and became a wildlife refuge. And now then this happened. So it's been and there's a lot of original landowners and descendants from them. There's young women that are really trying to fight to get, to protect Litetzen. And this is a social movement that really has a lot of effect in the big policymakers too. And you can see also that the policymakers really were trying to protect it as well, because we had 2 resolutions to halt the the construction of the firing range. And we've never seen the legislature so full. And it was not just activists, there were scientists and other people asking to please not take Litetzen. And yeah, I think it was a very powerful movement that really was carried by the whole community. And two of the main activists actually were elected and are now part of our legislature. So that also shows, you know, yeah, the weight of the movement and how people really related to it.
Well, on that issue of activism, and maybe, you know, maybe we could talk about, yeah, you spoke about specific issues with activism, specific topics. Maybe we could talk more specifically about experiences that you guys have had in terms of the work that you're doing. And also, maybe as we talk about it, I'm sort of interested as to what, as a researcher, what's coming in as an outside position, how you negotiate that activist area in terms of your own work. And maybe Mika, yeah, we could ask you to start on that.
Yeah, I mean, I shared about how, you know, my own not misperceptions, but maybe, you know, just the idea that you have a concept for what you're going to study, and then things just completely fall apart when you get there because nobody's interested in talking about that, right? So I think there's something really to be said about how you position yourself to, and I think this is what Stephen and Di are trying to do with this book, right? To try to how do you do engage scholarship? How do we update our approaches and methodologies for doing research? And I think there's a lot already that's been written about participation, right? How we engage with local communities and who we decide to work with. But I think it really requires this openness and an ability to a willingness to listen, to really spend the time to hear what's important from local perspectives, rather than translating them for the things that we want to see. And obviously those things are inevitable, right? We're drawn to these issues. We research these topics for a reason. But I think there's something to be said about how you position yourself to best listen. Like in the chapter that I'm trying to write right now, I mean, everybody that I worked with at the beginning, they say farming's really easy, right? But I did not find it easy, especially at the beginning. And I think there was a really important moment for me where I'd been like hoeing in the rice field for close to like a week, and I had like 21 blisters on my hands. And this was like anytime I walked down the street, everybody wanted to they're just dying to see my hands, right? They're just like, oh, did you hear, like, kind of thing. And just after that moment, it was kind of like everybody wanted to talk, everybody wanted to share, because, you know, a lot of rural smallholders think that farming is backwards, dirty. You know, there's this perception that, like, why would somebody from who knows where he or she is from come out here to learn about there must be a scam here. I must really like have to tell them what they might want to know, right? But when you have those moments that reposition, that you're just trying to see things from the perspective of the community on the issues that matter, from the perspective of the way that they make decisions. And during the election, especially, where the community itself is just, the tension is palpable. People are really going at each other to try to win this seat of power. There's almost nothing you can do, right? The families that you stay with, the people you interact with, lock you into oh, I saw you with so and so, so that means you're partial to them, and that's always going to happen. So these elements, these dynamics are really important and interesting. And I think, you know, just one additional story. When I was there, like, there's also like Islamic missionary. I don't know what you would call them, but they come and they're trying to re-educate indigenous populations about what modern Islam is. And the Kajang is unique because they're a customary community which have these beliefs like Elsa was talking about, right? Those, even though there's an outside religion influence, the local practices are still fused together as part of daily practices. And a couple times I was staying in homes with the people trying to re-educate what the right type of Islam is. So there's these identity battles that are going on. And, it was such a contrast with me trying to how do you do things? Trying to learn as much as I could about the way people think about issues locally, with this presence of saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. This is what the book says. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And it just allowed for really interesting discussions, being at eating together with these perspectives about what's right. I mean, the richness of what comes out of engaging in those discussions are really fascinating. And I think the idea of engaged scholarship, we should be thinking at the forefront about these issues all the time.
And actually, I just have a follow-up question that I want to add when to that when the other panelists speak. Is there, in your experiences, there's already a recognition of what the issues are out there in terms of the landscape and land, and we as scholars maybe come in and say, well, we know the issues, but the issues are already known to these people and these communities? Is that in terms of the engagement that you're working in? Would that be a fair statement, or in terms of the interaction that you're having? I mean, we talk about land privatization or deforestation. These issues are known to the communities, and we have a tendency to just say, oh, they need to do this, get this slip of paper, as Courtney says. So.
I don't know if that was, go ahead. I don't know if that was directed.
That's directed to everyone, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So actually I can speak directly to that. And it's interesting because what you say, Guy, in one sense is right, because the people are living on the land. They know what the issues are. They know what the impacts are. In the case of the project that I've been working on, one of the focuses of our research was climate change mitigation policies and the enactment of climate change mitigation policies. And so in that arena, it was really interesting because the people did not know what was going on. And then the outside knowledge that we had as researchers was really important for them. And so we were able to come in and really talk to them about about what REDD+ is, reducing emissions, deforestation, and degradation. We were able to give them case study information about what has happened to different communities in different places with these projects. And we were able to arm them with some appropriate questions and some ways to negotiate their positions and to understand what promises may or may not come out of this initiative. And we were able to go in and say, oh no, this place that looks like it's just a regular economic land concession and they're just clearing the forest. No, this is actually a forest restoration project, and it's connected to climate change mitigation initiatives through Korea and the Cambodian government. And they're trying to tell the rest of the world that they're conserving carbon by taking down the forest and planting pulp acacia trees. So in that sense, they didn't know. They had no idea that any of this was going on. And so that was really empowering. All the other stuff, they were well aware. In fact, a lot of the other stuff, they had to tell us what was going on. We came in, we had no idea. They're like, no, this is happening here, that's happening over there. So it really was a nice partnership on that front. I'll let other people.
Yeah. So what you talked about, like, is it well known? I really think that Protehila Tetsen was really in the front line there to tell the community how important Protehila Tetsen is, and was really like empowering the community and educating the community about these different aspects of why it is important to preserve the landscape. I even went into like making memes of like endangered species and talking on social media about all these different aspects. So I really think the movement was so important, not just to educate the people in the community, but also the policymakers. They kept on doing this over and over again and got really attention from them, which was really important. And I think um, your question relating to as a scientist or a scholar, I think what I was trying to do with being part of this movement and research is trying to see how I can have these voices better heard, maybe through like this book or other means, right? And how can we find solutions for the community? My research is not just this NEPA process, it also includes other things, but I do think that the how the knowledge about the landscape and how important it is was really driven by Protehila Tetsen. And I did participatory action research too. I included some, like natural resources policymakers, everybody kind of that was in that same kind of policy space. I asked what they thought about the NEPA process, but I also asked what solutions they could think of within our current political system. How can we legitimize these voices for the people, right? And that's another important aspect of my research, where I was hoping to give back a little bit to the community. And so there's some solutions that we were thinking about, and maybe, I don't know if we're probably going to get into that maybe later, but I really wanted to emphasize that like, by Protehila Tetsen really bringing all these issues up, I really think the voices of the people really need to be legitimized more.
Yeah, I maybe following up on what you say, maybe we could the panelists could share a story or a success of their work or the community work in those communities in terms of these land use issues, and then we'll open it up for questions for the final half hour. Maybe Mika, you want to start a story or yarn, as they say down here in Australia.
So I was starting in a little bit earlier, so I just wanted to talk about the last point, but I'll transition it into that question as well. So I think for some of the themes that I think we've all been raising in Kajang specifically, a lot of it has to do with accountability, and people are looking for accountability of decision making. And so whether it's the state and democratic decentralization that has happened in Indonesia, and elections, and there's people are starting to have a lot of distrust over the system. They call it locally money politic, right? And so they see that elections are really a process of people trying to gain access to power, and the processes that are being done, it undermines the overall system of accountability. And I think that's where the issues of Islam come in. People are looking for accountability in other forms. And then there's Kajang, right? The idea that this is a long-standing traditional practices, ancestors passed down through the generations. They have their oral code called the Pasang, and that's really important, and it connects to the question that's being that I see here directed to me on the Q&A, which about the lettered word, right? And the Kajang, it's like a protection mechanism. So it's very distrustful of outsiders. So if anybody starts to write things down, especially on legal documentation, they have a saying, they have a pasang that says specifically that as soon as you write something down, it loses its meaning, right? So the idea of documentation, of trying to redefine, I mean, the Dutch were doing this 100 years ago, right? So they have their own accountability mechanisms so outsiders don't redefine who they are. So in terms of the law and accountability, there's this dance that's happening that's, I think, really fascinating, that is so easy to kind of fly over the radar on. In terms of redefining the landscape and as a follow-up to what I was just introducing in terms of accountability, is that, you know, I was going around with a forest ranger one day, and we were looking at a tree. He was like, that tree is just amazing, right? And everybody knew whose tree that was. It's not land rights. It's not written down as somebody owns it. But if somebody tried to cut that down, there would be a system that would stop that from happening, even though it's not, registered to somebody, right? And there's all sorts of ways of seeing that tree, right? For the lumber that it creates, for the shade that it provides. People are thinking about these definitions in different ways. In terms of what gets defined as what's allowable and what's possible in these locations. I'll turn it over to others, but I lots of stories about how the landscape is being redefined.
Ilse, you want to speak to that? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to quickly pull up like a quote. Let me find it. Okay, so yeah, I just want to emphasize the involvement of the youth too here real quick. And I think that's kind of a good story here. So the youth also, like the high school students, really stepped up in this movement and really were like producing videos, and we're also like organizing protests at the schools and in the villages. And they also testified at the legislature, and that was really powerful to see that happen. And just want to read one quote here from Scarlett Cruz, who testified and said, this is part of her testimony: "We are not ready to hear that our native species, unique and important to our island, which I and most of our youth did not get the chance to see, have become no more and gone forever." So I really think it's important that we kind of recognize also this is not just for the current generations, for the future generation, to protect these lands and to protect their culture. And the cultural identity is really important in this aspect, I think, to recognize. And I think that was a good outcome of this kind of movement too, that it's not just, the policy makers are all on board and everything, but the youth and other people were connecting to their cultural identity and saw Letetzen as the landscape of Letetzen really important to that. And I think that was really, to me, one of the most powerful things that happened within this movement, that the youth was standing up and really wanted to preserve that access to that space, and wanted to know how the healers use the plants and want to go and visit them when they're sick. So I really think the movement did a lot of positive things for Guam, and I really still hope that we can prevent this from happening. Yeah, and I'm actually seeing my notes real quick. Was there another question, Guy, that you had?
No, what I thought we could do is maybe have Courtney speak, and then we'll take questions from the people, the people watching. So okay. Courtney, do you want to speak on that issue?
Yeah, I can. And I did. We should have planned this better. Elsa, you should have gone last, because yours is such a lovely, uplifting kind of story. And unfortunately, the story that I have is not nearly so lovely and uplifting, because we're watching as Cambodia slides into real, much stronger authoritarianism and is taking heed less and less of local people's protests and of the international community and the eyes of the world. And so with all of the support that we've given and with all of the incredible work that the Prelong Community Network has done over the last few years, in just these last few months, and even starting in February of this year, and especially during the years of COVID, the national government and the Ministry of the Environment has blocked their access to the forest. And partly because of how powerful they became, partly because of what a strong voice they had, and the reports that they were publishing and the work that they were doing, they were becoming just too uncomfortable for the local authorities, and they have been banned. And we did some community mapping of resin forests when the reforestation project came in and started clearing the forest area. And we supplied maps that were made by the community to both the company and to the ministry. And when the company changed hands last year to a Cambodian-run organization, Cambodian and Taiwan-run organization, the first thing that they did is they came in undercover and they targeted the local resin tappers personally, intimately, face to face. And they said, we're going to take your trees. You can either sell them or you can lose them. The choice is yours. They knew exactly where the trees were. They knew exactly who to go to, and they knew exactly where to target their energies. So this is a fraught space. We don't know. When we did it, it looked like it was good and it looked like it was empowering. And then when the government decided to just change and decided that they were not going to play by any of these internationally accepted rules, it turned out to be exactly the wrong thing to have done. And it turned out to be sort of disempowering, which doesn't mean we stop doing it. It just means that we know what the implications can be, and that we maybe think differently about some of our strategies. So sorry about that, really. We should have switched it around. Now remember Elsa's really awesome story about the young people talking about the fact that they're ready to get in this fight. Thanks.
Well, I'll follow up then with a question to Elsa then to start off the Q&A section. The question is related to in what ways have social scientists been helpful to your work to protect this ancestral area that you referred to in Guam? And what kinds of assistance could a researcher who's work in these areas but is not part of the communities, the descendant communities, provide in your work?
Okay, yeah, so there's actually a lot of scientists, social scientists and others that are part of doing research at Letetzen. There's archaeologists looking at the, the landscape in the Late villages there. So I think they have been really important to add to the story. Social scientists, I think, looking at the cultural identity part is really important, I think. And I think social scientists can really maybe emphasize the importance of that, especially because, this research is also founded in, decolonization efforts, right? So I think it's important because they're colonized people, right? To provide that, right? That they can connect again with their cultural identity. I think that's a really important aspect of this whole story. And then, of course, the disempowerment that's being felt is really hard for some people to deal with. I think knowing that you might lose this land or these special resources forever is, I think, a really really hard to deal with for a lot of people, and especially also for the original landowners too, to see this not being resolved, for generations already. And I think it's important that we bring those issues forward. And I actually, for my research, so as I was mentioning, I interviewed, of course, all the activists, and I was very engaged in bringing those stories forward. But I also interviewed social scientists, actually. and you know, just biologists, anybody that was relating to this issue, and they all came back with kind of similar answers to, you know, like that there's really a disempowerment right now, and that we really need to change these rules and regulations. And the NEPA, and I'm sorry, I should have you know, like clarified that a little better, but National Environmental Protection, you know, rules and regulations are really at the moment really not sufficient in protecting people. And there's also currently Julian Ogden, who is a lawyer. He actually did a submission with, in partnership with Unprecedented Nations of and People's Organization. He did file a submission on behalf of Protégé with the United Nations Special Rapporteur of Indigenous Rights. And it's really important to say that the people really decided that the NEPA is not sufficient to really look at these environmental problems, and especially environmental justice issues that we're dealing with right now. And there is no consent ever given to the community. And I think that's important to highlight, that we taken that into account. And social scientists also looked in, you know, are very big advocates of having the people's voice heard.
Thank you. There's a question here for all the panelists, and I'm thinking about the blisters on your hand, Mika. Have you found yourself going outside your comfort zone or at great lengths in activist efforts related to environmental conservation, or Indigenous cultural promotion while conducting your research? And how was this experience, and how do you think non-Indigenous scholars would have fared? I'm sorry, how do you think non-white scholars would have fared in similar situations? So where have you gone out of where have people gone out of their comfort zone, and what's their experience in that process?
It's a big question, and I think there's a lot here. You know, one of the first things that you know, working in Kajang was difficult at the beginning because of they really don't like. They're really distrustful, right? And that's because of a history of distrust, right? So building trust is really difficult, and there's reasons in that in place, right? So just being able to sit in the conversations of the elders, and to be able to understand what's going on in the processes, it took a lot of it takes a lot of work, and it's all about building trust and relationships and mutual understanding. And I think everybody, you know, one thing that's very absent from my research is women's voices in particular, right? And it's not that I'm unaware of that. It's just, you know, the connections that you make locally. You know, at first, building relationships with local youth was playing soccer with them, like in the afternoons every day, right? So these become your connections. And you know, there's land use systems about that women, there's indigo, which are land rights specific for women that I would love to be able to explore. And working with a grad student now who is from the region, speaks the language much better than I do, who can explore these issues and better understand these things. So I think there's benefits and drawbacks in various ways. Like one of the things, because of networks I had initially going into this research project, because it wasn't a relationship with Kajang, it was a relationship with land rights recognition, was that I was invited to present the Kajang case at the president's office, right? At a panel trying to interpret what to do about Indigenous rights recognition. So on the one hand, it gives you access to be able to raise these voices. And I think it's really important to be cognizant whose voices you're raising, so that they don't get misinterpreted, right? So I'm totally aware of the issue of who I am and what I was doing there, right? When I walk down the street, people shout "Balanda, Balanda," and Balanda is a reference to Dutch. Yeah, it means Dutch person, right? So, which is a reference to the long history of colonialism that took place in Kajang. I've maybe been to the Netherlands once, but and so these always prompted interesting conversations about where you're from and all these issues. So yeah, I think on the one hand, it doesn't allow you to have access to certain things. And I think it raises the importance of building networks and relationships with other people that can help with those issues. On the other hand, you can use those to help draw attention to key issues. So I think there's many different ways that things unfold with this question that we need a lot of time to continue to engage on.
Unmute. Courtney, do you want to speak to that issue, or Elsa? It doesn't. Whoever.
Yeah, I can speak to that issue. Just kind of picking up where Michael left off. One of the things that's become very visible to me is the way that, especially with gender, for example, it really gets approached bureaucratically as a box to tick, right? Yes, and people that I work with, they do say, yes, we had a meeting and there were five women. So it's a counting mechanism. But in terms of engaged research and engaged scholarship, really, I think that one of the things this era is showing us so clearly is that we can't work as individuals. In fact, we're sort of ineffective as individuals because we can only get at one part of it. So as Michael was saying, you can talk to the president, maybe, right? You can get access to authorities, but you can't talk to the women, right? For me, I can't talk to the young men. I have no idea what the young men are doing, and these guys are the loggers. They're the ones that are going out and driving the informal logging market, or actually being sort of roped into the informal logging market. And I can't hang around and talk to them and see what's making them tick and what's working for them and what kinds of things would make changes for them. So we're all as individual researchers in these landscapes, we're all limited and we're all kind of boxed in to particular avenues and with particular strengths. And one of my great, going outside of the comfort zone didn't have anything to do with the field research. It had to do with the work I was doing with other engaged white people and to push at them to stop yelling at each other. There was a lot of kind of conflict between, oh yeah, that person doesn't know what they're doing, and they only did these kind of things, and look at that ridiculous plan that they made when they were trying to do this campaign, and these people didn't engage properly when they tried to engage with the World Bank. They misled local communities. So there was all of this bickering among different collectives that were trying to do some good work in and alongside of local communities. And intervening in that is very uncomfortable and is very difficult. When there's a lot of really good projects going on, but everyone has their own skill set and everyone has access to particular kinds of processes. And one of the things that will strengthen what we're doing is to be more inclusive and to be willing to look at all of each other's failures and all of each other's strengths and use those accordingly in different spaces.
Elsa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to say I started when the movement started for Litetzen, I was already part of it, but I was part of it more as a biology to start with, right? And then this has been going on, I think for 5 years almost. I kind of got to understand by talking and being part of this movement more intensively, and understand really the cosmology of the indigenous people better by talking to them. But I always try when I go to events to really not position myself as a researcher, but being really a respectful participant, right? When I went to, like, there were candlelight visuals, there was walks at Litetzen. So I really tried to listen to the people. And I also became friends with a lot of the activists very closely. And I also went with the healers on different trips with them to the forest, and they showed me things. And that was really, I think, important for the research to be able to kind of speak about these issues. Of course, it's their voice, right? And I want to emphasize that too. It's really, I use a lot of quotes in my research to just make sure that these voices are all heard. And I also realized during the research too, like my neighbor who is an 80-year-old Chamorro woman, what she has been telling me all the time since I live here for 15 years is really what, transpiring to the movement too. And it's really the elders where we pull ourselves up. And there's a few elders in this movement. I can listen to them forever, and they have such deep knowledge about the landscape and why it is important to pass on the land to your children. And it's just all connected and is used. I kind of find it took me indeed a few years to kind of fully understand and I'm still probably not 100% there, but I mean, like, to understand really what matters from an Indigenous perspective. And I really hope with this story we can emphasize that. Another thing I want to mention is that, like what you were saying for your comfort zone, being a biologist, I do know some of these areas, and I do know the importance ecologically, and I really tried to also testify in the legislature and have my voice as a biologist heard, and that was appreciated from the community, that I emphasized the problems specifically to Suryanthus. So, and a lot of my research, actually all my research centers around that one tree. But I think it's important that with that scientists feel comfortable and empowered to really also like have their voice heard for the community. And I think the community really appreciates all different voices. And this movement was really all kinds of people coming together and trying to fight for Litetzen. And that was the beauty of it. Like there's a lot of archaeological work being done, and there's books being written. There's a children's book from Olympia Terrell that was recently published and really brought attention to this issue for the children. And then there is a beautiful book about Litetzen that came about, and it was not just about it was the archaeology, it was everything combined, like really all the aspects, social sciences, biology, the cosmology, the importance for the original landowners, everything was connected. And I think that's really important as scholars, that we kind of try have all these voices heard.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we wrap it up. And the question I'd like to ask relates to these conflicting perspectives that we've mentioned in our conversation today. And the issue is as an outsider, how do you deal with these conflicting perspectives? And in some cases, as in any community, there's more vocal parts of that community, and and Courtney mentioned issues of women as well as Mika. How do you deal with that in your work, and how do you sort of take a position on that more generally? Do you want to start, Mika, on that?
Sure. I want to just share two different things. I also want to say thank you if this is the last chance I speak. It's been a really, really deep and engaging conversation. So the first point that I want to say is that I'm driven by just the research tradition of focusing on vulnerability, right? I think that a lot of the way that I approached the research was trying to understand who is most vulnerable in these communities. And the common thing that people talk about the Kajang is this essentialized, they have this egalitarian society where everybody treats each other the same. And yes, in a philosophical, moral sense, that's true. But there's also a very deeply ingrained caste system. It's not called caste, but there's this history of the slave caste, the people that weren't landowners, that were built into the local hierarchical systems in society. So in the way that I did my research related to following kind of how landscapes are recreated was trying to continue to keep the focus on the people that were left out, right? So as land use systems were changing, you can really see who's not getting access. And there are specific reasons that drive those changes of people who can't get access to rice fields anymore, so that they can't produce their function in the social systems to be a good member of society, who are pushed to the margins, that have to migrate to find work in other places or in more vulnerable conditions and more challenging situations. And I think there's lots of great research that guides us on this, and throughout the research, learning about other cases from elsewhere about how to continue to train our focus on vulnerability is really important. And the second part of that is kind of corollary, right? So taking this focus on vulnerability and using it through our positionality, perhaps, to engage on those that hold power on these conversations. So with the village, it was easy for me to have a conversation with a local village head. They'd always invite me over, right? So you find opportunities to slip these conversations in. What about these situations where people are really, coming up with very, very, are dealing with situations that are very difficult, right? And they're members of your society. So how do you care for those type of people? What kind of welfare systems are in place locally to support issues like that? And these are uncomfortable conversations, but I think it's our responsibility as researchers in terms of how we think about our values in these processes as well. One situation was, I would always ask elected village heads what their solutions were for agriculture. And their solutions were always, we need to test the soil, find out what the best agriculture is so that we're not poor anymore, and that'll overcome poverty. So it's a very technical solution, everything, and it relates to exactly how they became successful, right? And people don't have access to those means, or can deal with the risk that's associated with that in agriculture. So I think trying to help them think through those processes of why that's the solution for them and maybe not for others are really poignant conversations that we as researchers in our engaged research can help to raise, not necessarily provide the solutions, but at least deepen our understanding of the problem.
Thanks. Elsa, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can totally relate to what Mika says here for sure. And you oftentimes get that comment, it's just the activists, right, that think that way, and maybe not the whole community, right? You get that often, but I think, as Mika was saying, like you do participatory action research, and that is for more unserved communities, right? But I think it's not, in the case of Guam, it's not necessarily because you're not there at the protest that you don't think that way, especially because, like, you're dealing like with the Department of Defense, which a lot of people have families here, right, that are with the military. So it's not always a easy issue to talk in public, or to be there in public, or you work, you have working relationships. So it's sometimes not an easy thing to speak up. But I do think by the fact that two of the main drivers of the social movement, actually co-founders, were elected into office, really shows that people care, because otherwise they would not be, you know, like elected by the majority of the people. So I think that was a very good statement from the community itself there. But I do think it's important to raise these issues as a scholar, for like, it doesn't need to be the whole community that is necessarily standing behind this issue too, if that wouldn't be the case. I think, and especially this is dealing with you know, Indigenous rights. I think it's really important to have these voices heard through the research we're doing. Yeah.
Courtney, will have the last word.
You keep giving me the last word, Guy. I don't know, but I do have to. I'm going to just sit on this point that Micah made at the very end. That is really important. One of the things that engaged research does, and that engaged researchers do, is that we go into places and we ask questions, and we have conversations, and we have conversations with lots of different people. And because we are structurally outside of the system, we can sometimes push uncomfortable conversations a little further than a local person would push them. And you know, well, she's just a white person. She doesn't understand good manners. She has good manners. She has bad manners. And you can push things a little farther, and you can cut people off when they're talking too much. If you're having a conversation in the group, and the one powerful voice is going on and on about how great everything is, I can stop them from talking, and I can ask other people to talk, and we can begin to start having a different kind of conversation. And even sometimes we do live in our own thought bubbles often. And it's very easy to become completely unaware of someone else's circumstances and of what it means to be in those kind of circumstances. And through the process of doing research and being engaged, we can break some of those bubbles, and we can kind of make a space where people can see things differently. It doesn't necessarily mean that things change, but it can sometimes change the conversation, which is part of the beginning.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to all our panelists. We could fill the internet with a conversation for days, I think, if we wanted to. Obviously, the issues involved here are complex, and one of the things that I find personally that I'm interested in is this contestation of landscapes and how they change and impact the communities and the interaction with the government and with activism. So I'll leave it there. Stephen's going to talk about next week's session. I know I'll be there. Looking forward to it. Stephen?
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Guy, Elsie, Courtney, and Micah. This is really a very informative discussion, and we have 8 more that will have very similar discussion and in-depth discussions about engagement. But before I talk about the next panel, some of the attendees are requesting for certificate of attendance. So if you are, please complete a short survey. The link is posted here on the chat box by Maddie. Please complete the survey. This survey will have the information. You'll put in this information where we will send your certificates. Please complete the survey, even if you are not requesting a certificate. This will help us improve our future panels. And speaking of panels, so panel 3, we'll continue the discussion. We'll actually have an example where the state, the Taiwanese government, incorporated customary indigenous land use system in their forest management policies. And so our discussions next week, we'll have examples from Bali, Indonesia, Bicol, Philippines, and Taiwan. And registration for panel 3 is also available on the webinar webpage, and Maddie just posted it on the chat box. So thank you, everyone. To those who, for the questions that we weren't able to answer, we will share them with the panelists, and we hope that we can post them on either on Facebook or on the webinar webpage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
时间刚刚。